All right, so welcome again to our final housing series workshop. We are hearing from each other today. So first on our agenda, we have Ryan Dodge with City of Sacramento. And we've asked Ryan to talk a little bit more about the city's recent ministerial approval and just some of the work they're doing. So Ryan, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent, thank you. And do you see my screen right now?
Yep, looks great.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to SACOG for inviting me to present today. I'm Ryan Dodge, a city planner for City of Sacramento Community Development Department. And I'm here today to talk to you about ministerial approval of infill housing. There's a state permit process, and also the city has a permit process as well. So in 2017, the state of California passed a number of bills to address the housing shortage and high housing costs, one of which is Senate Bill 35. And specifically, SB 35 requires the availability of a streamlined ministerial approval process for infill housing development projects in localities that have not made adequate progress towards the regional housing needs allocation arena, as required by the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So 95% of California jurisdictions, including the City of Sacramento, are not currently meeting our prorated RENA and are therefore subject to the state of California's streamlined provisions. So SB 35 is in Government Code 65913.4. So we like certain aspects of SB 35 that we decided to create our own ministerial permit that would be more attractive to developers and would help meet our needs as well. So as many of you are well aware, there are two types of project approval: discretionary and ministerial. So discretionary means that project approval requires the decision maker to exercise judgment or deliberation in the approval or disapproval of a project. This is typically through a public hearing at whatever level your jurisdiction typically approves projects. For us, we have director level and planning and design commission. So this is distinguished from a ministerial permit that only requires staff to determine whether there's conformity with applicable design standards, development standards, land use regulations, and other statutes, ordinances, and regulations. So an infill housing development project applicant for the City of Sacramento would have three paths to choose from when submitting a planning application. So we got the standard discretionary process, then we have the state of California ministerial option, or the city's ministerial option. So to talk about ministerial permits, some key points to keep in mind is that they streamline planning approval only and would not change building or other department requirements, so it doesn't have anything to do with building permits. They require the use of objective standards for zoning and for design review. So ministerial projects are not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act or CEQA, and they don't have public hearings. So this is to say that they're not exempt using the CEQA process. Ministerial procedures are actually entirely outside of CEQA. So there's no option for litigation under CEQA for those projects. They involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. They're uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable to the applicant and public official. So you can't have standards internally, somebody applies and then you say they have to use them. Everybody needs to know, it needs to be out there. So to that effect, the City of Sacramento created objective design review standards from our existing subjective design review guidelines. So I do want to mention that mixed use projects are eligible as long as 2/3 of the total building square footage is residential. So some of the benefits of a ministerial approval process would be to reduce risk and lower the time and cost of producing housing through expediting the planning approval process. For SB 35, it's either 60 days or 90 days for qualifying multi-unit housing projects, thereby reducing the turnaround time significantly. It provides more certainty and clarity on the planning approval process to housing developers, thereby reducing development risk. And it delivers tangible savings to the cost of housing projects by eliminating the cost and time for environmental review, which could be up to several $100,000, and decreasing carrying costs like mortgage payments on the land and pre-construction loans by reducing the length of the planning process. So these next two slides highlight the key differences between the state permit and the City of Sacramento permit and how projects may or may not be eligible. So for SB 35, it has to be at least 2 housing units, but there's no maximum whatsoever. For City of Sacramento, we kind of wanted a limit on it, so we landed with 200, thought about different amounts of units, but we figured over 200 units is something that we might want a little more discretion with. As far as the affordability requirements, SB 35, 2 to 10 units, there is no requirement. For 11 or more units, it's 10% for Sacramento. For some jurisdictions, it could be 50%. So all depends. As far as the prevailing wage requirements, we don't have anything in our permit whatsoever. State of California does have prevailing wage. It's required for 11 or more units. I do want to mention SB 35 states that no off-street parking can be required within a half mile from transit or in architecturally or historically significant districts. And then overall, there's a cap on 1 space per housing unit. So there's some other differences between the two permits for us. In addition to avoiding historic structures, which both permits don't allow for, our option, we just said we don't want them in historic districts at all. We're on a separate process right now of creating objective standards for our historic districts, but we didn't think this process would be appropriate for it at this time. So each historic district, it has its own context-sensitive design guidelines. We really want that discretion. There is the demolition considerations. SB 35 says that within the last 10 years, no tenant residence can be demolished. For us, we gave it 1 year. And then we had a couple other things that we did, and this is kind of how we had our own flavor with our permit, is that we want to make sure no housing development projects came too close within a landfill. And then we have quite a few areas of the city that have planned unit developments, and kind of like historic districts, it's a little more context sensitive. And so we didn't want to have that as part of the process. So that the state permit does require specific project review timelines, either 60 or 90 days, depending on the size of the project. And so the way it works, projects are considered compliant if the city does not respond. So there's hard deadlines, it's called deemed approval, that if you get an application and you don't do anything about it and you just don't have enough time or you miss the deadline, it gets planning approval and it's done and there's no way to appeal that. For the city permit process, we're trying to stick with those timelines, but we don't have deemed approval for it. So today we have 4 applications that have come in, really all since May. So SB 35 was approved January 1st, 2018. It took about 2.5 years before we got our first application. That one is approved. It's Coral Gables in South Sacramento. It's some rehabilitation and then some new units, and it has affordability, obviously, because it's greater, it's 11 or more units. For the city permit, we've been seeing more interest in that one, even though it's not available in as many properties in the city. Where it is available, it's a more streamlined process. So we have this 1212 Village project in North Sacramento. Then we have this 2010 Broadway Apartments and mixed-use building in the Central City. And the third one that we're seeing come in is CCH Foreign Road Senior Housing in South Sacramento. So in addition to the ministerial permits, we have been working on other areas. One of them is that previously with another project, we did eliminate minimum parking requirements within a quarter mile of all our light rail stations, and we reduced the requirement by 50% within a half mile of light rail stations. Regarding our impact fees, we have 2 things going on. One is an option to defer paying impact fees towards later stages or phases of a project. And then the other one is for projects that have affordable housing. We have eliminated pretty much every one we can possibly eliminate of the impact fees for those. We've also streamlined our review process, bringing down the level of review, sometimes from the Planning and Design Commission down to a director level, and in some cases down to the staff level for further streamlining options. And we are in the process of updating our code to come into compliance with the state's density bonus law. And then we're going to take the opportunity to see, like we did with SB 35, to see if we can go beyond to further encourage the production of affordable housing or even other housing types. And with that, I want to thank you. And here's my contact information. And feel free to get a hold of me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate the great information you shared with us. Can you just touch on the approval process, what it was like getting buy-in, if you had trouble with, what the process really looked like with council, planning commission? Were they supportive? Did you have bumps in the road? What did the buy-in and approval process look like for you?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And so part of it is we brought together updates to our code to be compliant with SB 35. At the same time, we were attempting to create our own permit. And so for the most part, folks were supportive. Our city ministerial permit process was part of a previous effort in early 2019, where we brought this housing streamlining menu of options, where we had 50 different strategies and actions that us and our partners could take to encourage housing, be it affordable, market rate, and different types of housing. So this was part of that process. So we had that, and that was approved by our city council. And so I think the most of the pushback we got on our city permit process was that some folks did want to have affordable housing be included in that. And in our perspective at the time was that SB 35 was available for 2.5 years and nobody was taking advantage. So there was already a ministerial option that required the affordable housing that nobody was taking advantage of. And while we do need affordable housing, we also need all types of housing for all different income levels. And so the city permit is just one thing. We are in the process of updating our housing element. So as far as affordable housing, there's a lot of other steps that we are taking to address that. We saw the city permit that if we did require that affordable housing component, that it would be pretty much just like SB 35 and not worth the effort essentially, and not attractive either since folks were not taking advantage of SB 35.
Brian, can you expand a little bit on why you think that is, why folks were not using 35 and why they are, at least it seems like, very interested in your ministerial process? Is it the prevailing wage requirement, affordability? What do you think it is?
So we did hear the affordability seemed like the big one to us, the obvious one, but we also did hear from developers that the prevailing wage really is a big one, at least for even affordable housing projects, at least in this area here. I think the Bay Area, it's more typical. So SB 35 really is, I wouldn't say taken off at all, but it's been utilized more so in the Bay Area. So I think for us, it was a combination of both of those. Is the affordability. I think some projects, even projects now we're seeing that have the affordable housing with it, they're seeing the city permit as a more attractive option than SB 35. And that may be in part because of the prevailing wage.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Questions, comments, thoughts that you have for Ryan? We'll give everyone a minute to type them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. So we'll give just a second. Thanks, Ryan. And you'll have the opportunity to ask again after our presenters. We have open discussion scheduled. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Just want to make sure PowerPoint for this presentation will be available. Thanks for the question. Yes, we'll make the recording of this workshop and the presentations available, and we'll send that out to this group that you can share with others by the end of the week. So yes. So thanks again, Ryan. Appreciate your thoughts and comments. So Lauren, you're up next. Lauren Hucker with the City of Roseville to talk a little bit about specific work. So Lauren, take it away.
Hi there. Yeah, so I was asked to talk a little bit about the city's specific plan process because the city has for decades now leveraged that process pretty heavily. And then our residential projects can use the projects consistent with the specific plan exemption. So what I'd say is a little unique about our specific plans is we do, I mean, it's a plan level project, but when it comes to CEQA documentation and the level of specificity in our specific plans, we do get more at the project level stage. You know, when we're looking at a specific plan, we don't just have a wetland study that's based entirely on a high level aerial survey that you then later on have to go do specific site assessments and get permits site by site. For our specific plans, there's usually a more detailed assessment, and we get the applicants get their wetland permit for the entire specific plan area. So it goes into a lot of detail. We provide a lot of fine-grained detail in the CEQA process for our specific plans. So then residential projects that come in, they may need a subdivision map, but they don't need to go through an exhaustive environmental process, which is a huge win for them. The upside to that is obvious. We have all the streamlining that comes into play because we've gotten into such detail and we have it down to very specific levels. My cat is howling, I apologize. But then the only downside is that when you look at our specific plans, our large lots have a specific number of units actually allocated to them. It's not, we have a specific plan and there are, you know, 6,000 units in the planning area. There's 6,000 units in the planning area, and this specific parcel has 241 units assigned. Now, our specific plans do have some flexibility built in, understanding that you might not build 241 exactly 5 years down the line. And so you can transfer units between large lot parcels. And that's an administrative approval. It's not a specific plan amendment. You can get an administrative approval to do those unit transfers. So the vast majority of the residential development in the city, there's no further CEQA documentation. Almost all of our residential projects in the city are exempt through the specific plan exemption. And so that's a huge boon for development. It means that projects get approved pretty quickly and are processed and hit the ground pretty quickly. And then in some areas, we have even the entitlements are streamlined. So we have in our downtown specific plan, we have an over-the-counter design review process. You know, when you come in with an apartment project or something, we have a process, a design review entitlement required, where we look at the, you know, whatever we all look at, building and materials and all of that stuff. But instead of having a public hearing requirement, in that specific plan, we have what we call a minor design review, and you can actually go through an over-the-counter process for that. It's an administrative approval, doesn't require a public hearing. So again, there's a lot of streamlining there. And then we also have in that specific plan a lot of incentives, you know, not going into huge detail, but majorly reduced parking standards, no requirement to pay regional park fees, things like that. And we're also looking at leveraging this process elsewhere now. We are looking at additional, what we're calling corridor plans in the downtown Roseville area on Atlantic Street, Douglas and Harding and Douglas and Sunrise, where we're going to be doing a similar thing. We're preparing specific plans over those areas. It'll include over-the-counter permit streamlining for residential projects. We are making sure our housing element itself, actually, the environmental for that is providing coverage for those at an upper level, so that, again, as projects come in, the idea is that they will not need to go through their own environmental process. They will be able to be exempt through consistency with the specific plan. So that's sort of our process in a nutshell. I think it works really, really well in our city because we all know that one of the biggest barriers, especially to denser housing and affordable housing, is actually CEQA lawsuits. And so having that clear exemption is really, really helpful to avoiding drawn out lawsuits, imposing barriers on housing projects. In our downtown plan, we've had 3 affordable housing projects approved within the last couple of years. One is constructed, that's LOSI. Another is just getting finished right now, Main Street. And then we have another one that did get entangled in a lawsuit because it required more entitlements. And it was still exempt, but we had a litigious landowner nearby who they've lost, but it takes 2 years to demonstrate that it was a case without merit. And that's a huge problem. But that one's finally, we just won last week, I think. So that one's finally going to move forward. So I think that's all I had for you, and I'm open to hearing any questions you have about that process. We've been using this process for quite some time, and there's a lot of support from our council and planning commission for us moving forward with other specific plans like this to sort of tee up future development.
Thanks, Lauren. Appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your specific plan work and other efforts in the city. If you have questions, thoughts, or comments for Lauren, will you type them in the chat where you can take yourself off of mute? Lauren, I know this might be different for different plans, but how typically might you pay for a specific plan? Sometimes it's from developer. Are there other typical ways that you fund these?
Yeah, it varies. Most of our specific plans are actually privately funded. The developer group gets together and coordinates and consolidates land and comes forward with an application for a specific plan. That's how all of our specific plans in the west area of the city have gone forward. However, the downtown plan was city-led, and the corridor plans we're working on are also city-led using grant money.
Great. Okay, so we have a question coming in. As I'm reading that, Lauren, I know Begging Minds will definitely want to know what's your cat's name in the background.
He's a talker, I'm so sorry.
Okay, question, is the public well aware of the environmental review process through specific plans, or do they still come forward as a project getting built and wonder why they didn't get to comment on the project?
Yeah, you know that no matter how much outreach we do, that is a thing that happens, right? Like the downtown plan itself went through a huge, really extensive, multi-year community outreach process with like community boards, commissions that reviewed. I mean, it was a huge public process, and yet we recently had a housing project go through that area. We had a bunch of neighbors say, I had no idea, you never involved us. So part of the issue, of course, is that neighborhoods change, new people move in, they weren't there 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when a plan was approved. And part of it is people just have a really hard time engaging sometimes with those long-range planning processes. When it's a very specific project on a very specific corner, that's when they get engaged. But the overall land use plan that made that project possible, it's sort of too big and esoteric. That's one of the things we've been talking about a lot with our housing element, outreaching to our Roseville Coalition of Neighborhood Associations. It's emphasizing you need to talk to everybody because this is the project that's going to result in downstream projects, and we don't want to have a whole bunch of people say they didn't know. We're trying to get the word out. So yeah, I mean that happens. But it's really helpful that we have the support of our council because they know, that we've gone through this outreach, that we did go to the public, that this did involve a lot of scoping, and that this is how this is supposed to work.
Great, thanks, Lauren.
Oh, sorry. I'm wondering if you can speak to one of the pieces of specific plans that doesn't always get a lot of attention, but is also important, is just the infrastructure side and what sort of benefits you see in Roseville from specific plans kind of outlining what infrastructure is necessary and a financing plan for that.
Yeah, it's not uncommon in large specific plans in many jurisdictions that a certain amount of detail or specificity is deferred until later, right? You'll have a master plan and it'll say you in general need these major facilities, but the specific location of this item or that item will be determined later. In Roseville, that is not how we approach specific plans. We actually get really fine-grained and we figure out exactly what infrastructure we're going to need. We identify where that infrastructure is going to go, and all of that is built into the financing plan and into the development agreement. And that does, to your point, contribute to downstream streamlining and reducing costs. You have more upfront cost to put the plan together, but then individual developers aren't paying for those costs later instead, as they're trying to go through and identify. I remember there was a project long ago when I was working for a different organization, and they couldn't figure out how to move forward because there had been a big study. I won't even say what type of infrastructure it was. There was a big study of infrastructure, and it was, well, we're going to need this, and at some point the buck is going to stop and somebody's going to have to pay for this. And the buck came all the way down, and by the time it got to where it stopped, the cost was so high that development in that area ceased because it hadn't been sort of comprehensively planned from the beginning, with the cost for that spread evenly over every single house. So I do think that it's really, really helpful in the city that we get to that level of detail. Again, the downside is that there's less sort of flexibility as new projects come forward, but the upside is consistency and transparency for people who are getting property and developing it.
Lauren, another question for you that's come through on the chat. On average, how long does it take to prepare specific plans and get them through CEQA clearance?
I don't know that there is an on average, you know what I'm saying? We've had, usually multi-year, right? It's a multi-year process. But we've had a specific plan recently. The Amaruso Ranch plan took a decade. But often that has nothing to do with internal processing. It has to do with other factors. One of which is, as you all know, that sometimes what happens is you're working with Fish and Wildlife or Army Corps, and you come to an agreement and you build your plan based on that agreement, and then there's a staffing change and they say, I don't know what you're talking about, change the whole thing. And that is one of the things that happened to Amaruso. So I'd say you need to expect it to be a multi-year process generally. You're talking about thousands of acres of land typically. But I wouldn't say that we have an average because so many factors come into play.
Great, well, thanks, Lauren. If you have other questions for Lauren, you can continue to type them in the chat and we'll circle back after the rest of our presenters. So thanks again, Lauren. Appreciate your insights from the city of Roseville. So I want to turn it over to both Dov and Sherry Metzger with the city of Davis to talk about some of the CEQA streamlining. So Dov, I might first.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so one of the ways that our MTPSCS actually can have some direct impact on land use is through CEQA streamlining opportunities. So both SB 375 as well as SB 743 created CEQA streamlining and exemptions that are available to projects that meet certain conditions and are deemed to be consistent with the MTP. And so this is something that SACOG takes a lot of pride in. We're one of the few regions in the state that actually takes advantage of these opportunities. And we actually provide some really handy worksheets on our website that can help you as the lead agency to make some of these consistency determinations. We're always available as well to provide a letter if you request it that will provide concurrence on your determination of consistency. I'm going to share a link in the chat to our fillable PDF worksheets that we just updated on the website in time for ARB approval of our 2020 plan. But yeah, please do take a look at those. Let us know if you have any questions about some of the specifics. I think I'm just going to hand it over to Sherry to talk about how the city of Davis has been using these opportunities. But again, I'll chat the link to the worksheets. Sherry?
Thank you, Dov. The city of Davis is definitely one of those communities that has benefited immensely from the worksheet and from SB 375, et cetera. We have a grand total of about 8 projects that we have used this methodology. I know for some of you, like Lauren, 8 projects isn't very many. I came from Rockland for many years, and I know 8 projects we'd probably do in a month. But in Davis, things are a little bit different. Things move at a different pace, and that's greatly due to the fact that what we do in Davis is largely infill, which is, of course, the subject of today's meeting. So this particular aspect of the law of SB 375 and the transportation priority, the sustainable communities, all of that has benefited us greatly. We have had to, on a few occasions, where we thought the project might be subject to litigation, marry up the provisions of the exemption along with an EIR, which kind of seems counterintuitive. But what we have found is that when we did get challenged, the judge agreed with our conclusions. And so we thought that was a good sign that we were doing it correctly. And since then, we have approved probably 3 or 4 projects with just the exemption route and not putting it together with an EIR. So it does work. It is simpler in the sense that you don't have to do the circulation, you don't have to respond to a lot of comments in the EIR process and all of that sort of thing. It does, however, require a bit more effort in terms of substantiating your conclusions and the adoption of studies or the inclusion of studies to support your conclusions in the document. The last one, I was telling Dov and Adrian, the last one I did was 1,200 pages, which is a lot. That is a lot to say that the project is exempt, but that's what it took, and the project did get approved. So I think one of the other things that I would like to say is that my planning commission 2, maybe 3 years ago now, when the first time they saw this, they had a really hard time understanding what it was and why it wasn't an EIR and why we had to give them all this documentation to say that something was exempt. So if you do choose to use this, I think it may beg a little bit of a tutorial for your decision makers so that they can understand a little better what it is that you're asking them to do and why, without just jumping into it. Because I think most of the time when we talk about exemptions, we're talking about, categorical exemptions, and it's just 1-page document that says you don't have to do CEQA. This is very different. It's a lot more of a proof, if you will, that you've already done all the analysis and that there isn't any impact. So I would encourage you to use this provision if you can. I know in Davis, we are lucky enough to have a very robust transportation system in that we have 2 bus lines, we have a train depot, and we have the freeway running right through town. So we have a lot of transportation available to us that I know not all the jurisdictions have. And that, I think, is a big piece of it. But overall, I do think it is a helpful process to do. And I also think that looking at the list, I was putting together the list of projects that we did. I've noticed that the more recent ones have not been challenged. It was the early ones that got challenged. And I think it may be a bit of a learning curve on the part of the public as well, as to what this is and why it exists and what it's supposed to be doing. With regard to the projects themselves, I would say about half, or maybe more like 3/4 of them were mixed use, which of course is a project type that a lot of communities are trying to get into these days to reduce our VMT, to reduce our air pollution impacts and all other sorts of things. And this particular method under CEQA is definitely geared for that kind of project. The other ones that we did were very dense. And so I think that too is something that works well for this particular exemption. The other thing that I will tell you that you can follow in Davis, especially those of you who are in the more suburban communities, we are now pushing 7 stories in Davis, which, at least for me personally, having come from a community where 3 or 4 stories was considered really tall, out in the suburbs, 7 stories seemed like a big building. I know in downtown Sacramento it's not, but in little suburban communities it is. And we do have one of our first buildings that's actually up. It's on Russell Boulevard. And if you want to get a sense of what a 7-story building looks like, you make a trip over to Davis and get a feel for it. I was shocked that it was not as overwhelming and oppressive on the street as I thought it might be. You know, folks in their imagination always tends to be a little bit gloomier than what reality usually turns out to be. So for those of you who are in those communities where your decision makers are very concerned about what does over 30 units to the acre look like and what does 7 stories look like, we have those buildings for you to look at. I think that's probably all I have, unless there's any questions.
Thanks, Sherry. As people are typing in their questions or comments or thoughts for Sherry into the chat, I wanted to note that, Sherry, it's something you said in our prep call I thought was really important, which is you were hoping that other jurisdictions within the county or smaller jurisdictions similar to yours would reach out to you, so that way you could share insights or learnings from your previous efforts. And I think that applies across our region, right? It's important to reach out to one another if you're going through this process.
Definitely, I definitely agree. As someone who's worked in the greater Sacramento area for a long time, in fact, I was looking at the list of names and there's only like 2 or 3 people that I've known for years. I've been around for quite a while. But the reality is that what happens in some parts of the county or the region and what happens in other parts of the region is very different. And a lot depends on the way the decision makers decide to handle the issue of development itself. And I do have quite a bit of background in 2 very, very different kinds of communities, them being Rockland and Davis. And I also spent some time in Folsom. So as with Stephanie and her staff. So I think that I can definitely gladly, as Adrian said, I'm willing to share my experience. I'm at that point in my career where I'm ready to just give it away, so to speak.
Sherry, a question came through for you, and I think it's referencing the project you were talking about, those 1,200 pages, so the lengthy one. Given that amount of documentation for the exemption, do you think it would be better or cheaper to do an EIR instead?
No, definitely not. Even though this exemption document was more expensive than we originally anticipated, it was not the same price as an EIR. One of the biggest differences between the 2 types of documents involves the whole process of responding to comments and I hate to say this, but there's a great deal of repetition in an EIR, and the time of writing and making those repetitious documents is something that we all have to pass on to our developers and the development community. It's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is. And this type of document doesn't do that. It's very much to the credit of the state, it's very much a checklist type of format where you basically, it's a yes or no, and then you document why it's not an impact. I mean, for the most part, what you're saying is the plan is consistent with these other plans, they being your general plan and the MTP, and the rest of it is just documentation.
And I guess worth noting, right, that in the slow-moving legal world, these are relatively new laws and streamlining opportunities. You know, we're talking 10 years old. And it just sometimes can take some time in CEQA law to establish, precedent. We've actually had a couple projects in our region, but in particular, the Yamini project in the city of Sacramento that was challenged, and then the streamlining was upheld relatively recently. So I think those precedents are being set, and I think moving forward, probably a lot of the challenges will get easier, not harder on these things.
I agree, Dov. And in fact, we have a project in Davis that was challenged by, it was in our downtown area, which is, again, this is only a 4-story building, but that was considered a big deal. But it was a 4-story building, and the adjoining older neighborhood sued the city. And interestingly enough, the judge decided that the CEQA was done correctly, which we did use the exemption for that, but that the city had incorrectly interpreted its own general plan, which for those of you who have ever been to any of the updates that are offered on an annual basis, that's kind of a no-no. Judges don't get to interpret what legislative intent of your city council. So obviously the city appealed, and we expect to win this one, which if we do, then that would mean, of course, then that we did the CEQA document correctly, that SB 375 was implemented in its proper form, and it was something that we should have done. So I think you're right, Dov. I think as time goes on, we're probably going to see more and more of these appear, and then hopefully maybe less and less over time as people figure out that this is a valid way to do CEQA.
Sherry, one last question for you. When preparing these exemptions, is it you as staff, or is it consultants? Is it attorneys who's preparing these exemptions?
All of the above.
Team effort.
It's definitely a team effort. Obviously, we as a very small planning department staff do not prepare the studies that are necessary in order to support the findings that are in the document. We did, however, prepare the documents themselves. So the information that we put in the checklist to support the finding was done by staff. But that information, of course, came out of the supporting documents. It is not unlike an EIR in that vein, where your consultant basically says, I'm relying on this expert and this is what he concluded, only they put it in the format of a typical EIR. It was very much like that. So in this case, I have the benefit of a gal named Jessica Lynch who works with me now, and she has some previous experience in on the private sector side, so that helped. In addition, we just basically did a lot of what planning staff plagiarism, where we did a lot of cut and paste from the supporting documents and put it into the actual checklist document. And it isn't unlike any other mitigated neg deck or any other document that I've prepared in my many years of doing this. It's a lot of just saying the statement and then referring to the supporting document. So it isn't something that the document itself necessarily needs to be done by a consultant. Obviously, you have to weigh that against the time that it takes to prepare it, and whether or not your decision makers are, bent on the staff doing it, or whether they're acceptable with consultants doing it.
Well, Sherry, really appreciate you sharing some insights from the city of Davis and Rockland and Folsom. So thank you all across the region. So thank you again, Sherry. We finally want to turn it over to Desmond Parrington with City of Folsom. He's going to talk about some ADU work he's doing there. And Desmond, I believe you have a PowerPoint to share. Ooh, you're on mute, Desmond.
Yep. Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I'll go ahead and share the PowerPoint presentation. So just a moment here. And okay, can you all see that?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. So I was going to talk about our efforts here at the City of Folsom. I'm Desmond Parrington, Principal Planner at the City of Folsom in the Community Development Department. I'm going to talk a little bit about our about ADUs. So we've had quite a bit of ADU development, but particularly in our historic district. And while it's one way for all of us to provide more affordable housing in the city, there's been some challenges, particularly related to the contrast in the design. So you've got, cute infill houses, and then we've got kind of boxes, large boxes that are going into the historic district, which has raised a concern. But of course, there's also the streamlining efforts that that were the result of legislation, quite a few bills that went into effect in January this year. The other thing is that we kind of have some unique approaches where increasingly we're seeing in our area south of 50 in the Folsom specific plan area, where new developers such as Lennar are doing the multi-generational housing, where they've built in essentially an internal ADU. So rather than just getting a single family home on a lot, you're actually getting two units right there without anybody being able to tell the difference. And Lennar is doing about 20% of their build out as these multi-generational homes, whereas other developers, they're offering them, but they tend to offer them as an option that the customer selects, rather than something they actually are building out as part of their build out. So you can see here, this is the first floor plan in the blue area there, where they have the living area, the internal ADU, the bedroom, the bathroom, small kitchen area, and then the living area. So what we did was we did a fair amount of community outreach on this topic, because it had become controversial in the historic district because of two factors. One, the size and design of the ADUs, and then the concern about them becoming not a source of more reasonably priced housing, but instead Airbnb or quite expensive rentals. So we actually worked very closely with HCD, the Housing and Community Development staff, and a shout out to Jose Ayala over there, and to Paul McDougall, who were very helpful in providing us feedback on it. So we adopted that this July, and it what we did was basically there is no planning review for 800 for an ADU that's 800 square feet or less and 16 feet tall or less. They go straight to building permit. But it's the larger ADUs that are greater than 800 square feet, but still less than 16 feet tall, where we've established some objective design standards to ensure that, particularly in the historic district, that they fit the design for that area. So the interesting thing about our historic district is it's not a listed or registered historic district in the California Register for Historic Resources, and as a result, we can't exempt it from the state requirements. So instead, we looked at some basic objective design standards that we could use to encourage them, but also encourage good design for the ones that are above 800 square feet. The other thing that we did was that if they were taller than, we basically set our threshold at 16 feet, but if they were taller than that, then they would go to our commission for approval, again, to ensure that privacy issues were respected. The other thing that we did to try and make more resources available for folks that were doing these was we created an ADU website. We created a workbook, which I'll talk about in a bit. We also created an application checklist to make sure that they knew whether they needed to go to planning or whether they could go straight to building. And then we identified the areas that were exempt from any kind of parking standards. And then finally, we, for junior accessory dwelling units, which require a deed restriction on them, we put together a sample deed restriction form. So they didn't need to worry about, talking with an attorney or anything like that to have that prepared. So our proposal, that ultimately our commission and council blessed citywide was, as I explained, if you're less than 800 square feet or less and 16 feet tall or less, you're automatically approved for planning. You go straight to the building review and permit process. If you're greater than 800 square feet and you meet our design requirements, then you're approved. You can go to building and to get your permit. But if you're greater than 16 feet tall, then there is a staff level design review, and then depending on whether you've addressed those privacy concerns and addressed the objective design standards, you're either approved or denied, and then you can appeal to the Planning Commission. This was one of the areas that was confusing for us in the legislation, and we got a clarity on this from HCD. They indicated to us, for those jurisdictions that are concerned about really large ADUs and privacy concerns and affordability concerns, frankly, HCD did say there was nothing in the law that prohibited us from setting the standard at 16 feet, and then anything above that, you could do discretionary reviews. So that's ultimately what our commission and council wanted because of the concerns about the height in some areas. And so that's the approach that we took. In the historic district, again, very similar process. The only difference is rather than having staff do the design review, we have the historic district commission there do the design review if it's greater than 16 feet tall. And that's because our historic district commission is much more involved in the review of projects in the historic district. As I mentioned, we have a website that really walks people through what's needed. And then, as I mentioned, we have the map there that shows all the areas in the city, kind of highlighted in that orange or tan color, where parking is not required, and it shows the locations of the transit stops there. As I mentioned, we put together an accessory dwelling unit design workbook. There's kind of two parts to that workbook. There's the basics, which provide information for homeowners, designers, and contractors, and then one that is specifically focused on the historic district. Again, it kind of shows best practices, and the idea is to help applicants and designers when they're doing ADUs in the city. So, for example, in the historic district, we have objective design standards for those larger ADUs, and the applicant needs to select a design style that's appropriate for the historic district. An example here is Craftsman, and then they have to meet the specific objective design standards, so associated with that design style. So if you choose Craftsman, those things include like multi-pane sash windows, low pitch gable roof, exposed braces under the gables, and so forth. So we've got visual examples of what's involved there for those larger ADUs. In the main part of the workbook, what we call the kind of the part one, we spell out for the applicant exactly what's involved in the whole process, from basically from start to completion. So not just about what the city's involvement is, but also things to think about when you hire a contractor, things to be aware of in terms of site conditions, things to be aware of with infrastructure, when fire sprinklers are required and when they're not, when solar is required, and those types of things. And then we also talk about other construction things to take into consideration, like whether you want to do traditional construction or modular, where it may save you some time and money. Also, the benefits of universal design for this type of unit, particularly if you're looking to house elderly family members, or if you're even considering renting it, how this can benefit somebody who might have mobility challenges. So that kind of wraps up our presentation. I think the thing that we are excited about is that particularly in our specific plan area, that we're getting more of these, and there is interest, and it's a way for us to kind of increase density in a single family area without changing the overall character of the neighborhood. And I think that's the really appealing part of this. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Desmond. First, just a question about the workbook. Is that on the ADU website? So if you visit the ADU website, you can access the workbook from there? Yes,
absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So we'll make sure we make that available to everyone. And did you, as staff, create the workbook? Did you have a consultant help you with that?
We actually created it. Staff created it. We were funds were tight, and some of the council members suggested that we provide this, and given the questions that we were getting from homeowners and in some cases from designers, and some of the concerns that had been expressed by previous ADUs in the historic district, we thought that this would be a pretty helpful resource to folks.
Great. So we have a few questions for you, Desmond. One you started to address and touched on in the workbook, which is, does the workbook include universal design features or accessibility features? And so you touched on a lot of that with especially the historic district.
Yeah, we actually have a section of the workbook that's devoted to that and gives specific examples. We really do want to encourage that, because I think that there are huge benefits, particularly if you've got elderly family members. This means that they can stay in the ADU much longer than they might if it had, than if it wasn't designed for, with those universal design features.
Great, thanks. Another question is, are there incentives provided for ADU owners that provide deed restricted units? Did you develop the workbook in-house? So the answer to that is yes. But the other question is, are there incentives provided for ADU owners that provide deed restricted units?
So we haven't done that. We do have some incentives in that we don't charge impact fees at all right now for ADUs, regardless of their size. We have the authority to do that, but we're not currently doing that. So that's a big incentive. We have not yet developed any incentives for deed restricted ADUs, but that's something that we might look at, but we haven't done anything at this point.
Another question about landlords. So someone commented that they've heard concern from tenant groups that ADUs could potentially create a bunch of new landlords with zero experience with rentals and fair housing issues. Do you provide landlord education materials as a part of your resources?
Yeah, in the workbook, we've got links to information for new landlords. That is a very legitimate concern about the whole creation of all these new inexperienced landlords, and so we do provide some resources. I do think it's something that as a region and as a state, it's probably something that we need to get out there more, because there are quite a number of requirements for landlords, and that people do need to be aware of that so that they're not inadvertently breaking the law.
Great. Well, thank you, Desmond. Really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk about your ADU work in the city of Folsom. We'll again be sure to share your ADU website and workbook with everyone here, as it's a really robust tool. So thanks again. Before I turn it over to Dov to talk about our next steps in the REAP grant, I do want to just open it up, open the floor for anyone that wants to talk about the work they're doing. We know so many of you across the region are doing really great work to get more infill housing and development in our region. Or if you'd like to reference a jurisdiction or city that you are looking to for examples, or you think has done good work, I'll just pause for a moment so we can recognize anyone else. Feel free to unmute yourself, turn your cameras on, or type in the chat if you'd like to do that.
This is Kate with Sac County. I have a question for everybody on the call. I know several of us have been thinking about missing middle housing in terms of an opportunity to provide equity in housing as well, and potentially get more affordable housing in opportunity areas. I'm just curious if other people have been thinking of other ideas around that topic, equity in housing, and getting creative in terms of getting more high density or low income housing in opportunity areas. And I've also heard good things about the city of Roseville's missing middle housing program in particular. I don't know if Lauren, I'm putting you on the spot, but if you have anything that you'd like to say about it, that would be wonderful.
Could you clarify, what did you hear said about this? Because, in terms of missing middle housing, I'm not.
Sure, sorry, I can elaborate. I think it had to do with what you're doing specifically to your single family zoning districts to open it up for more density.
So we had thrown out there as one of a list of options to city council was to do that, and city council said absolutely not. So we don't have a missing middle program we're moving forward with.
Thank you for being honest. That's something that we all have experience with. Thanks.
Yeah, Kate, this is Desmond. We had a similar experience to Roseville. Actually, one of our council members did bring up the question, but the commissions and council felt that with the new ADU laws and the potential for up to 2 ADUs plus the existing home, so the JADU and then the detached ADU, they felt that the state had already kind of answered that question for cities, and so they were seemed less inclined to support opening up the single family zone to allow more types. The thing that we've been struggling with is outside of downtown and midtown Sacramento, it's been hard to actually identify those developers that are actually doing missing middle development in this region. I mean, you'll see folks do the occasional duplex, but I've not seen anybody do garden style apartments recently, or an apartment project that's 15 units or less, or triplexes or fourplexes, outside of downtown, midtown, and maybe Oak Park. I don't know if anybody else has had experience or can cite some developers that are actually doing that in suburban areas.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up and echo what you just said, that yeah, they said no for a similar reason, that now basically every single property can have 3 units on it through the ADU and junior ADU process. And then in terms of whether or not we've seen any No, we also, I mean, we reached out to developers to talk about the demand for that kind of product in Roseville, and it's just, we even did some flash vote surveys, and there's not a lot of demand or interest, at least in our jurisdiction, from homeowners. We had one project recently with 12 duplexes. And that's the only sort of in-between type project we've seen in years and years and years.
Yeah, and I'll jump in real quick too. Not with regard to examples of recent missing middle examples, but in the city of Sacramento, we are bringing to City Council next week our key strategies for our general plan update, and part of that is opening up our single family zones, and you know, it's going to be a process through our general plan looking at density, how we regulate intensity differently. So moving towards an FAR based approach rather than the general plan regulating density at all. And then as a result of you know, moving forward with that, if that gets adopted, we will be following up with a subsequent citywide rezone for consistency with the general plan. And we've also identified it as a draft policy and program in our housing element, which we'll be bringing to Planning and Design Commission on the 10th, and you know, going up to the May deadline, and basically bringing that back forward in January and February as a draft policy. So looking at, you know, opening up the single family zoning to allow up to 4 units, and you know, so that's where we are right now. You know, things can always change or be modified, but we're really excited about that and think we have some good support for it. But you know, obviously we're already kind of having some conversations with neighborhood associations that are catching on to what's going on. And so, you know, having those conversations right now.
Go ahead, Sherry.
I was just going to say, one of the interesting things that I have noticed in my years in Rockland, I think I have worked on a grand total of 5 accessory dwelling units. They just weren't something that people in that neck of the woods would do. They just wasn't something they were interested in. I think the typical person who lives in Rockland and Roseville area is a member of a family where they have small children in school, and they move to that area primarily for the schools. And so they're not really interested in taking on the notion of an accessory dwelling unit and what it all entails. Now, then I'm over in Davis, it's completely different. And it's interesting to me. In fact, I think my building department is now surviving on plan checking accessory dwelling units. We have had a tremendous influx especially since the start of the COVID, on folks wanting to build accessory dwelling units. And I think it's very interesting that it's sort of a cultural dynamic. I think some of these people intend to lease them out to students because there's a gross lack of affordable housing, or even housing in general, for students in Davis. I don't know if any of the rest of you were even aware of any of that, but there are quite a few kids that are still couch surfing and all that kind of stuff. COVID in some ways actually helped them because they got to go home, and now they're doing their schoolwork from home, and they don't have to worry about surfing from one friend's apartment to another. But the notion of folks building accessory dwelling units, it seems to me, is more driven on the benefits of an economic situation and their own personal situation than it is on housing policy set by the state. And the other thing that I noticed in terms of the missing middle issue, it does help with, you know, we have some pretty expensive housing in Davis. And I think that it's helping with the affordability issues there. So that's another reason why folks are deciding to build accessory dwelling units in Davis.
Desmond, go ahead. I see you're off mute if you wanted to.
Oh, I just, yeah, the other thing that I was curious about with what Greta's doing is how is she educating the public and decision makers about this, or how is city staff over the city of Sacramento educating decision makers about that shift from away from density and to FAR? Because everybody gets really focused about density, and sometimes it can really sideline the real conversation, which sometimes is more about form and design. And I was just curious about what the city of Sacramento is doing to educate folks about FAR and the use of that.
Yeah, you hit on one of those points and what we have been, one of our points, speaking points about that has been the regulation of form rather than focusing on the number of units. But we've also been leading pretty strongly with an equity lens, and basically leading with that kind of missing middle, all housing types conversation. We included this as one of the things in our general plan. It came out as a really big theme for us in our first round of outreach for our issues and opportunities phase. Housing and housing affordability was a huge flag for us from the community, and that was a way for us to support this as a key strategy. And we brought it back to the community in our citywide outreach and our community plan outreach. We're updating our 10 community plans, and we got a lot of great feedback and a lot of good support for it. And I think that leading with the history of how we got here I think it's a really important way to frame the topic, because there's a lot of facts that are there to support this kind of move. I think when you talk about redlining and single family zoning as a means of furthering segregation historically. So that's kind of been some of our speaking points. I think also the one thing is that our zoning code is still going to regulate density until we update it. And that's going to be, something that we're going to be drilling into further is, what exactly that those densities are going to look like in zones, where we want to keep it, where we want to up the density in the zone. So it's not like we're completely removing it right now. So that's, I think, another thing that's a little bit helpful is kind of slowly having this shift rather than doing it all at once.
Yeah, Greta, a good plug for our very first workshop, which focused on the historical context of zoning, and that is available for sharing if you want to share that with your leaders or put it on your website or make that available. I think that's a great historical context setting is really important. There was a comment in the chat I want to mention, which is the city of Santa Cruz has some good examples of pre-approved building plans for ADUs, and the city of Citrus Heights is using their LEAP funds to help create a similar program. So another good example there. Any other comments, thoughts, ideas, brainstorms, projects you're working on before we move on?
Adrian, this is Desmond. I just had a question about one of the areas that Sherry touched on, and this is, the issue of kind of height and design and form. I was wondering if there's going to be any discussions with the SACOG board in terms of kind of education, kind of getting them to think, again, less about density and more about form and design, because again, you can do a 60 dwelling unit per acre project that fits in quite well into an established commercial corridor, But if you just talk about 60 dwelling units per acre, or you talk about 4, 5, 6 stories, that sets people off. And the funny thing is, I've had discussions with folks where you point out communities to them, and they like the look and feel of that community. But then when you talk about the fact that that community, this area of the community built out at an average 50 or 60 dwelling units per acre, that's a non-starter. So I was just curious about whether there's any kind of discussions planned with the board, because it's often the decision makers that are the ones reacting, and also reacting to the public's interpretation of 60 dwelling units per acre, because they think of 60 units or 7 stories or whatever, without kind of really understanding how the design and form can make a huge difference about how that project looks.
I think that's a great question, Desmond, and we I will talk about in a second the commercial corridor task force work that we did, where we have in our policymakers toolkit kind of a page that talks about that to a certain extent. But this is, going back to the question about missing middle that we were just talking about, this is a critical question, right? Because for missing middle development, 30 units an acre is actually not that dense, right? Most fourplexes are actually going to be over that. So the use of density as a regulator of intensity, that kind of breaks down on these smaller sites, and it just doesn't really work the same way that we do when we just think of, well, low income apartments, 30 units an acre is sufficient, right? It sort of breaks down on the smaller sites. So it's something we can look more into. This is probably premature to talk about, but we do have some money from Caltrans to bring on a consultant to do a build out inventory. And as a part of that, one of the optional tasks was getting at this exact question of can we get a little bit more information that sort of illustrates the different types of form at different densities, and kind of helps folks visualize what those differences could look like. So that's something that we're certainly looking into as a part of that as well. But I'm curious if anyone else has comments on it.
I think I'll reference what Cascadia Partners talked about in one of our workshops, which is when you walk through a community or talk with a community, it's often the areas of preserving the neighborhood charm and the historic qualities are the more dense, older parts of the community, right? So definitely an education piece there, Desmond. Thanks for bringing that up. And there was another comment in the chat, a link to general plan update for guiding principles from the city of Sacramento, stepping on to what Greta was talking about. And any links that are shared, we'll be sure to share those back out with you. So thank you all for, oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've just been sitting here ruminating over it. Greta, I'd like to talk to you at some point, just because I'm thinking more and more about your discussion about form over density and thinking about our commercial corridors as we move forward, and how that conversation could be really useful in a context like that. Because again, going back to what I said about how our council wasn't interested in pursuing quote unquote missing middle for various reasons, but I think that concept of, if you're looking at increasing densities, focusing on the form it takes rather than on the number of units there are is a really helpful lens.
Yeah, happy to chat.
And this is the conversation we want to continue and to have. So, we'll of course have future housing planners meetings where we get the opportunity to have these discussions with one another, so we can make sure to build in, this open time. But we'll make sure that we're continuing to connect each other after the workshops conclude. So I'm going to turn it over to Dov now to share his screen so we can talk about the Commercial Corridors Task Force Toolkit, the REAP competitive grants, which the framework has been sent to you, and then kind of our follow-up and next steps. Go ahead,
Great, and is that PowerPoint showing up?
Yes.
Please. Okay. So yeah, thanks. I think we wanted to make sure folks are aware of a parallel effort that SACOG has been working on called the Commercial Corridors Task Force Policymakers Toolkit. A bit of a mouthful, but it really puts to paper a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about as part of this workshop series. The task force is made up of 10 SACOG board members and then a variety of other public and private representatives who we're all focused on how we can catalyze infill on our commercial corridors throughout the region. Of course, a lot of the ideas are sort of applied to everywhere, not just commercial corridors as well, though. So the task force first started earlier this year by identifying what some of the barriers to infill on these corridors are. Includes a lot of the usual suspects that we talk about as a part of this group. And we began putting together the policymakers toolkit to respond to and address these barriers. So the toolkit is divided into some of the big policy categories, each with a series of specific policies attached to them. So starting with infrastructure, that was quickly identified as a big barrier on some of these corridors, particularly the older auto-oriented corridors. The next section is on simplifying the development review process through actions like the City of Sacramento's ministerial process that we just heard about. Reducing costs and fees is about structuring fees in a way that incentivizes infill and smaller unit sizes. The zoning barriers section includes many of the ideas that Cascadia, like Adrian was referencing, presented in the second workshop related to density limits, regulating form, setbacks, parking, things like that. We have a section specifically about finding ways to fund affordable housing through both market-based strategies as well as direct funding strategies. There's a section on strategies to reduce displacement as well through things like tenant protections, then case studies, and then finally a section that talks about the history of zoning and how past and current practices actually can reinforce residential segregation, similar to that conversation that we had with Professor Whitmore at the first workshop. So we're really proud of the work that went into this toolkit from SACOG staff, some local jurisdiction staff, who some of which are on this call, who generously helped to review it, members of the task force as well, who helped shape those policies. If you happen to remember the housing policy toolkit that SACOG released a couple years ago, you can kind of think of this as an updated version of that toolkit with new sections in it. So before we weren't really covering things like infrastructure. We didn't really have explicit sections on equity-focused topics like displacement, affordable housing. So this is sort of a revamped version of that. Really encourage you to use this document as a resource as you start to think about what you want to use your REAP money for. It's going to our board in December, but we'll make sure to send out a copy ahead of that. So let's see here. Great. So speaking of the REAP funding, we wanted to close the workshop series out with just a quick refresh of that program. I know you've been hearing about it a lot, but just a refresh here. You might recall the Regional Early Action Planning Grant. It's a one-time pot of money that was made available to SACOG through the 2019 governor's budget. It's intended to accelerate housing production through planning. This is our REAP framework that we've been implementing. We were able to access that first 25% of our REAP funding a bit early. That 1.7 million is going out right now to jurisdictions in the form of non-competitive grants for your housing elements. Your amounts were based on your RENA number, and then some went to our Civic Lab Year 2 projects. The remaining 75%, you'll have a combination of additional non-competitive grants, this Civic Lab housing series as well, and then the competitive grant, which will at a minimum include about $1.727 million. So This is a quick overview of the two pots of money that will be available starting in January. Funds for the non-competitive are based on RENA again, while the competitive depends just on how much you're applying in your application. The application period will be from January to March for both of these. The process will be just a simple letter for the non-competitive, and then a narrative-based application for the competitive grant. In terms of eligible activities, the non-competitive grant's pretty flexible as long as there is some sort of nexus to accelerating housing. The competitive grants are a little bit more geographically focused, though, to green zones. In terms of what SACOG is looking to accomplish, again, this is really an implementation mechanism for us for our MTP as well as our RENA plan. We're trying to increase and accelerate housing production, of course. We're supporting infill and revitalization in those green zones, reduce VMT, retain and expand community assets, and then really provide public engagement and support for equitable outcomes for low-income households and people of color. So any SACOG city and county member jurisdiction within the 6-county region that has an identified green zone is eligible for this competitive grant. There is a direct link to the green zones, as we said, in that your projects must be within those zones. The Civic Lab Housing Series has really been intended in part just to kind of get the wheels turning for potential projects, and we do require that you have attended at least 2 of these workshops to apply. In terms of eligible activities, the planning activities that have the greatest potential for increasing housing are going to be the most competitive. So always be thinking, as you're starting to think about projects, what is really going to catalyze more housing in these areas. So anything highlighted in the Civic Lab series here is going to be eligible, but maybe a particular emphasis to things like specific plans. Like Lauren was highlighting, these are really impactful documents. Yes, they can be pricey, but they just have a huge impact, both in terms of infrastructure and streamlining and all of that. But in addition to that, zoning code updates, anything that allows for by right housing, increased density, regulating by form, all of these ideas related to zoning are of course eligible. Infrastructure planning, and changes to fee structures, those are all fair game as well. Ineligible activities, so preliminary engineering for infrastructure that doesn't have a housing planning nexus. Capital improvements, really anything that does not have that nexus, like directly to housing planning, is ineligible. That is, a part of it's stipulated in the governor's budget that gave us the money, so it's sort of out of our hands on that. And then, of course, plans outside of green zones. The application process, we're trying to make this as streamlined as possible. We will likely have a small review panel made up of SACOG staff, external partners, that will score each question, and then just highest scores get funded. The timeline, so we are seeking a board action on this funding framework that we just went over in December. December 17th is that board meeting. And if we do receive that action from the board, we would be releasing an application and a notice of funding availability in early January. You have a couple months to do those applications. They'd be due March 12th. And then between March and May, we would be putting together, doing that review, and then putting together our recommendations to our lunar committee for awards. And then over summer next year would be when the awards would happen, with funding available pretty much immediately as soon as the contracting is done. There is a funding expenditure deadline in August of 2023 for these. And I just wanted to note on the timeline here, the minimum total program funding amount for this competitive grant is, as I mentioned, 1.787 million, but that could actually increase by the time of awards. So per the REAP framework, all unused funds from other REAP programs, like the Civic Lab housing series that we have here, as well as the non-competitive grants, if those aren't used, they get added to the total funding for this competitive program. So that means that we really need to hear from you between January and March for what you're going to be pursuing for the non-competitive funding, because again, if there's money left over from that, it gets added to the competitive pot, which actually impacts the maximum award. So we are going to be making sure that we understand what everybody is going to be pursuing in the early months of 2021, certainly by March. So I think I'm going to turn it back to Adrian to wrap us up on some information on the RFQ, and then we can maybe do questions after that. Adrian?
Yeah, great. Dov, you'll advance one slide, thanks. So we want to quickly touch on the open RFQ that we've mentioned a few times to you. The RFQ closes on the 30th, so next Monday. This will bring on a bench of expert consultants for two main purposes. The first will be for the bench to administer the technical assistance that accompanies this workshop. So that's individual consultation, it's proposal or ordinance review, it's best practice research. And the second main reason is to help you implement your REAP projects. So for the non-competitive and competitive pots of money, these bench of experts can help you implement your projects. So the main reason that this bench is helpful is because it eliminates the need for your individual jurisdictions to conduct traditional procurement processes where you have at least 3 competitive bids, you post formal procurements. It really does shorten the contract process, and it creates a lot of flexibility for you in the future, which I'll get into. So Dov, if you don't mind to advance one more slide. I want to walk through this graph, which explains what the bench does. I'm going to actually start from the bottom. So if you'll direct your attention to the bottom where it has consultant A, B, C, D, E, F, those will be the bench of experts that we pre-qualify. So applicants that apply in the procurement that closes November 30th, we will score them and pre-qualify a bench. For example, in Civic Lab Year 2, we pre-qualified 12 expert vendors. So we'll create a bench that moves up to the next bar that says Regional Consulting Bench. And we as SACOG will create overall agreements with each of these vendors. So SACOG holds agreements with the vendors, and then 2 things happen. The first is the pink arrow pointing to the right. We will sub-allocate you the funding that you receive in the non-competitive and or competitive pots through MOU. This looks very similar to what Greg has been working with you on for the housing element work. So you have likely, or your team has likely executed a pretty short, streamlined MOU to receive that funding. It would look similar to that. So we need to get you the money. And then in return, you tell us what you want to do. So you create a task order with the blue arrow pointing left. So you create your scope of work, your task order. You let us know which of the bench of vendors you want to use. And then we execute those contracts in a very streamlined way. So I want to emphasize that this is not a required process. You are not obligated to use the bench of experts, but the benefit is pretty significant because, again, you don't have to do your own procurement processes. We hold at SACOG the contracts with the vendors, so you're responsible for executing the MOU for the funding, which would happen regardless, and then a way more simplistic task order or scope of work for what you want to do. And that's a traditional scope of work that says, here is what the vendor will do, here's their timeline, their deliverables. So much more streamlined than in other typical contracts. There are a few things that are additionally different with this consulting bench that may be of benefit to you, which we think are very exciting. The first is that we are asking the bench of experts that are coming on board to be ready for future work. And what that means is that we will be allocating you money from this pot of money, the REAP funding that Dov just mentioned. But if you as a jurisdiction have additional pots of money in the future for housing related work to accelerate infill housing that matches up with what these vendors can do, then you will also be able to use the bench for that. So it's not just restricted for the REAP money. It can be used for other pots of money that you might have to execute similar types of work. This is very, very exciting because, again, it's just really streamlining the processes for you and making it much more simplistic for you to execute work, because you don't have to spend a significant amount of time recruiting and procuring for consultants, then executing the contracts. We will have that bench available for you for the REAP pot and for future pots that are related. The second thing that we think is really exciting is, in a typical contract process, you have a vendor on board, right? And then you execute the work and you pay the vendor, and then you submit a reimbursement to us at SACOG. Well, in that meantime, you have to float that money, right? So you have to pay the vendor and then you submit a reimbursement to us, and sometimes that can take a bit of time for us to get the money back to you to pay. So what we're trying to do is help you with that process. If you are a smaller jurisdiction, you're not capable of floating that money in the meantime, we will have the ability to hold your, instead of the pink arrow, us sub-allocating the money to you, we can hold your pot of money and pay the vendor directly. So you're still responsible for the backup, right? For making sure the work is done, that the vendor is executing the project that you want, but we can help facilitate that payment and streamline that process. That's something we're working with our procurement and finance team on. It's the first time we've done something like this. We have served as this project manager role, if you will, in other instances, but we think it could really be beneficial, especially for our smaller jurisdictions. We know you want to execute the work, but sometimes just all this going in between with the invoicing and vendor interaction is quite taxing. We understand that. So last slide, if you will, Dav. The final thing we'll touch on, this is the timeline. Dav was referencing this in the REAP competitive pot, but we wanted to bring this slide up because what will happen next is we will start the technical assistance that goes along with the housing series. To do that, we are going to reissue the survey that we conducted in June, July, before we started the housing series, because we are working with HCD to do this technical assistance. We want to make sure they're complementing what we're providing to you. We want to make sure that the bench of vendors that we're bringing on board is providing you the types of technical assistance that you want. And we want to make sure that if you are, through this series, have realized you might need a different type of technical assistance than what you said in the summer, we want to make sure we capture that. So we're going to reissue the survey that we'll be sending along when we provide you with this recording. And yes, the PowerPoints, the links that we've talked about, those will all be made available to you. So we can really better understand the types of technical assistance that you might need from this bench of experts. So with that, that kind of concludes the 4-part housing series. So we're really excited for what comes next. We hope these good conversations continue, especially amongst our jurisdictions. So we'll pause here and see if you have questions, comments, thoughts, ideas before we fully close out the series.